All right, I'm ready.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the Sidewalk and Park Bending Vendor Safety webinar. Before we get started, I'm going to introduce our interpreter, Margarita, who will guide you through how to select Spanish interpretation if you need this throughout the course of the webinar. Okay, thank you, Margarita. For those who did not hear because you were not on the Spanish interpretation, basically, if you go to the bottom of your pane, there is an icon that says interpretation and it's a little globe. If you press on that, you will be able to select English or Spanish. If you select Spanish, at that point, you will be able to hear Margarita speak. If you are either on English or off, then you will hear the presentation in its original language. And with that, I'd like to hand it off to David.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Rivera. I'm the Assistant Chief with Streets LA, Investigation Enforcement Division, and I oversee and manage the Sidewalk Park and Vending Program for the City of Los Angeles. So I'm going to go over the agenda a little bit. We're going to have some opening remarks from Commissioner Villegas from the Board of Public Works. We're also going to go over what is considered a crime, what is a hate crime, the impacts of COVID and crimes against vendors, and where should you report the crimes to, and what to expect after you report a crime. Anonymity in reporting a crime, how to protect yourself as a street vendor, and then we're going to have some question and answers also in Spanish. Okay. So just a little housekeeping. If you have any questions, please put your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will answer your questions at the end of the presentation. This webinar is anonymous, and the information you provide during the webinar will not be used to identify you for any criminal activity. We are recording this webinar to put this information on our website so you can share this video as well. So it's going to be making the presentation today will be LAPD, Commander Labrada, and then myself to answer any questions. LAPD, their job is to investigate and enforce all criminal activity, and to report it, it goes to 911 for all criminal emergencies. As far as Streets LA goes, we're going to permit the sidewalk and park vendors. We investigate and enforce any non-criminal violations of sidewalk vending. We also have a hotline that vendors can call, 213-814-1144, to voice their concerns or provide non-emergency tips for Streets LA investigators while we're out there. What we'd like to do is seek compliance with laws for street and sidewalk use to protect the public property, maintain access, and reduce hazards to the public. So now I'd like to kick it off to Commissioner Villegas from the Board of Public Works.
Thank you, Mr. David Rivera, for that introduction. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I hope that you find it informative. We do these to be able to educate our street vendors, and we do these to also just provide information. Today, you'll be able to hear from 2 jurisdictions, as Mr. Rivera pointed out. I'm going to reiterate that for you. You're going to hear from LAPD and their perspective and their remarks in terms of crimes and hate crimes, and then how it is impacting street vending. You'll also hear from Streets LA, and you'll be able to ask us questions as well, and able to get information in terms of additional information like permits or what have you. I'm glad that you're all here to be able to listen in and join us today. Please do not hesitate to ask questions. There's no question that isn't important. So I hope that you enjoyed today's session, and we look forward to hearing from you. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Commander Labrada. Thank you.
Yes, everybody hear me okay? Good. So good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to say some words. I'm Commander Al Labrada. I'm actually the acting deputy chief or commanding officer of Operations Central Bureau. Operations Central Bureau encompasses the downtown area, the East LA portion, which is Boyle Heights, El Sereno, the northern part of Northeast, Highland Park, and other parts of the northern end of the city, as well as the Rampart MacArthur Park, Westlake area, and parts of the South LA community of Newton, and of course the downtown area. So one of the most diverse bureaus in the department of LAPD. And one of the opportunities for myself as well to be on this discussion is also to serve as the department's liaison with the immigration advocates, communities as well. I am currently the deputy chief, but I'm also the liaison, and I'm also an immigrant from Mexico. I was born and raised in Mexico and came here at the age of 6 years old. English was my second language, so I understand a lot of the complexities that exist in our communities as it relates to the concerns, the lack of trust, and more importantly, the lack of reporting that occurs in many of our undocumented communities, not only with the Spanish-speaking communities, but as well as other communities in Los Angeles. So our goal today is to kind of educate the public as to issues related to a crime. You know, what is a crime? So a crime is an act harmful not to only some individuals, but also a community. So criminal behavior as it relates to our street vendors has been, as you all have seen in the news quite a bit. We've seen a lot of social media traction as it relates to individuals selling flowers, individuals selling elotes, and those tend to pick up a lot of traction because they affect the community. You know, there's always the tension and the anxiety that exists in communities where there's different races amongst the victims and individuals that are victimizing those. So for us, it's important to properly investigate those crimes and ensure that we put that information out to the community as to our efforts. Obviously, the concerns that exist as well as what is a hate crime? Hate crime is any criminal act or attempted criminal act directed against a person or public agency. So it could be a religious institution. It could be a location where individuals of a certain culture congregate, or private institution based on the victim's actual or perceived race, nationality, religion, sexual orientation, a disability, or gender because the agency or institution is identified with that particular group of people or person, group of identifiable race, nationality, religion, sexual orientation, disability, or gender. So there's a lot of comments to that, and obviously it's a long narrative, but it's very clear as to if somebody's intent is to criminalize or victimize or even just make a statement. So we do have two things that can occur. We can have a hate incident where a comment is made towards a person because of the topics that we spoke of, or at least the criteria that I mentioned earlier, or if there's a crime associated with that. And that can be, in our example for the vendors, it can be if somebody's out selling a product out in the community on the sidewalk and somebody attempts to rob them or attempts to take those products by force or fear that would create a robbery. It could be a weapon, it could be just fear, or it could be physical force. And during that process, there's comments that are made related to the person's sexual orientation, a person's race, or any nationality, and that could constitute it as a hate crime. So it includes acts which result in injury or may not include injury. It could just be a robbery where the person's items or items that the person is selling are stolen. However, slight a verbal threat of violence, again, I mentioned the threat of violence, which apparently can be carried out, an act which results in property damage, means they damage the individual's property, in which case it would become a vandalism. And that would constitute a hate crime if the individual's race, sexual orientation, or perceived nationality as well are part of that threat. Next slide. So in relationship to our COVID-related impact to our communities, we did see a slight decrease of a lot of the violence associated with our street vendors. And obviously we saw a reduction of vendors on our streets because of the COVID pandemic. But as we now start reopening, really towards the latter part of the summer and early this year, we started seeing an increase in vendors in our communities. Obviously, they're out trying to make a living and they're trying to support their families. But with that comes the increase of potential violence towards them because there's more of them out on the street. So we did see an increase of robberies related to our vendors. So it's something we really have to look to as not only addressing the violence that is occurring and ensuring that our vendors are reporting it, but also supporting them and ensuring that they find suitable places that are safe, and more importantly, that they're responsible as to where they're establishing a location to sell. Obviously in the city of LA, and that's going to be discussed more in detail, the permitting process, we also ask the vendors to be responsible. It's important that they set up in areas that are well lit, areas that there's traffic, and maybe get to know the surrounding businesses and residents. Because if they have a strong relationship with the individuals, they support one another, and it's not an animosity type relationship. Those individuals, including those businesses surrounding that vendor or the residents, can be supported, especially if the vendor is a victim of a crime. So it's important to have that relationship, but more importantly, be responsible towards that community. We want them to be able to support that community as it relates to the violence. And more importantly, ensuring that it's a clean area where the people are buying their items that are being sold. So next slide. Okay, so reporting crimes, it's been mentioned before. We obviously a crime in process, in progress, life-threatening. The person's serious injury, bodily injury, or serious harm, obviously life-threatening, that would be a 911 call. So you would call 911. They do have Spanish speaking, obviously, as well, in many other languages. We also have what's called the language bank. So if the person calls and maybe speaks Cantonese or speaks a different language, we do have the ability to put a third-party translator immediately on the call to be able to translate it and get crucial information to be able to provide our officers more information. Most important part, when individuals do call 911, remember the officers are responding with the information you provide us. So it's important, if you can, to stay on the line, especially in crimes of progress, if it's safe to do so, but provide as much information that you can to the officers and to the dispatcher. The more information you're able to provide, the better it is for the officers. Remember, these officers are responding with very minimal information, and it's very fluid information. We try to get there as quickly as possible, depending on the type of call, but it only based on our ability to get accurate information to either make an arrest or, more importantly, respond to the right area. So it's important that we get that information correctly as best we can. Contact your local police department for non-emergency calls. If the individual has already left and the threat of injury or life-threatening has ceased to exist, make sure you report it. Make sure that you call and report that information. So as long as it's not life-threatening. We do want to take a report and more importantly, know any trends that are occurring. The issue in many instances is that many vendors aren't reporting the crime because they don't feel a need to, or maybe there's a trust issue with police. The problem with that is our officers don't know there's a problem. So if there's a pattern of robberies in a certain corridor affecting vendors or targeting certain vendors, we won't know about it unless it's reported. If there's a pattern and we are able to learn that through the calls for service and more importantly, the reports being taken, then we can establish extra patrols, we can establish some awareness for our officers to be in the area to try to minimize the injury or damage or crime towards our vendors. So after you report a crime, so we complete an IR. It's a report and it shall be completed when an officer arrives to a scene and determines that a crime has been committed. We also take incident reports depending on the type of crime. As I mentioned before, if it's a hate incident, not necessarily a crime in general, but it's an incident that met the criteria as described in the hate incident, we would take an incident report of a hate incident. And that documents incidents in that particular community. And we would follow up as well on those, depending on the type of crime or incident that occurs. A lot of times the unwillingness of the victim is not important because it helps us when they provide specific information, they're able to follow up with additional information as they remember things. Maybe they get access to their camera, or maybe somebody provides them phone video. It's important for them to follow up with our detectives to make sure they get the accurate information. So after a hate crime, our obligation to our hate crime coordinators and our detectives is for the victim to be contacted within 10 calendar days. One of the things we look at, especially when it comes to hate crimes, is the ability for our victims to be provided services if they qualify, and more importantly, if there's any need for services for the victims. And then we'll provide follow-up information. We'll get follow-up information related to anything they discovered, whether video, additional witnesses that have come forward to support that, and then we will document that in the crime report. Our process is once that crime report is completed, our detectives will review it, it gets submitted, and then it gets submitted to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's crime unit, and they determine if there's charges to be filed. Obviously, if there's an arrest associated with that, they submit that arrest report as well to determine if charges will be filed and a trial will be commenced and so forth for the individual arrested. So there's also different levels of review with the Civil Justice Integrity Unit, Department of Justice, and obviously our city attorney's office for non-felony crimes, which would be your misdemeanor crimes that occur. So after you report a crime, as I mentioned before, the hate crime coordinator should contact you. Our obligation is that we notify the victim within 10 days of the initial incident to provide an update as to the status of the report. So, and they would be entered in the DOJ hate crime. As of now, as you all have seen in the news, unfortunately, we've seen a spike of crimes against our Asian American communities. So that information is tracked to know if we do have patterns in particular communities, particular vendors, particular culture or group of individuals are being victimized. It's important for us to be able to track that and be able to support those communities. Anonymous tips can be also provided 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. A lot of people, especially if they're undocumented, they should not have a fear of reporting it. When we call and report a crime or we obtain a crime report from the residents or the victims, we don't ask for a person's status or immigration status. We only need to know what occurred. We need to know if they were a victim of a crime, they were a witness of a crime, or they're reporting some type of crime. LA Crime Stoppers is independent of the LAPD, but it's a good opportunity for us as a community to be able to report crimes as well. And then you can also text the crimes. It's listed below at 274-637. And at this point, it's English only for the text crimes. Next slide. So how to protect yourself as a street vendor. I talked earlier regarding the responsible vendor efforts. So, as vendors, the community is out, there's a licensing process that's going to be discussed earlier, and the importance of working with those around us, whether they're businesses or residents, being cleanly, but that's the responsible portion. I think that we should always highlight that and be able to work alongside those surrounding us. A lot of times what we've seen with vendors is there's a hostility with surrounding businesses, surrounding neighbors, because the vendors aren't cleaning up, the vendors aren't being responsible with sidewalk access, and the residents have to walk onto the street. So those are things that I mean when it comes to responsibility. You want to be able to support your neighbors and more importantly, do the right thing. So you want to select a well-lit area. Biggest problem we see with some of the vendors particularly the ones that are setting up off hours to catch individuals leaving nightclubs, to catch in the younger crowds leaving restaurants and bars. Those tend to be victimized more because they're in dark areas, they're late hours, and then sadly, as it becomes later, the vendors have more cash on them. These are all cash businesses, and these individuals, these people that are taking advantage of these victims of the vendors know that there's a lot of cash at hand, and it's very difficult to track that. So well-lit areas, if you're setting up in an area with other vendors, get to know one another, look out for one another, potentially set up in areas where there's cameras, whether they're public places or private cameras, that you've been able to work something out. So as long as it doesn't violate the closeness to the individual businesses and so forth, or blocks their access. And then more importantly, avoid late or evening hours. I know a lot of the vendors want to set up during certain hours because of the money that it brings. But if you're unsafe, how much money is it worth to put your life at risk for injury or death when you're set up in a late night area that's unsafe? And then more importantly, it's a high crime area. So I really ask that you look at the potential of setting up in a safer, well-lit area, not in those late hours, in areas that are not going to be safe for you as vendors. Work in groups, get to know one another. I know many of the vendor coalitions have organized to have groups working together and set up in safe areas. And then more importantly, they provide information via the police, via the Bureau of Street Services, to provide information to keep our vendors aware. Avoid having large amounts of money on hand. That's important. However you can conceal that, however that can be deposited throughout the day, it's much easier rather than having that much cash on you, in which case it provides a venue for those individuals that are opportunists to rob you. Be alert of your surroundings. Report unusual activity. Some of the things we see with our individuals that are targeting our vendors is they'll case out the area for a little bit. They'll drive around, they'll look around, they'll come around to see what time you pack up, what time you close out, what your route of travel is on the way home. They want to see where you go home so they can victimize the vendors on the way home when they know they have a lot of cash. So just be very careful, alert your surroundings. If anything feels uncomfortable, go to a public area, go to an area where you can call law enforcement, and more importantly, is be safe. Carry an audible alarm. We've seen a lot of those whistles, air horns, devices that can trigger a lot of sound and scare them off. If they hear a lot of noise, tends to scare them off as well. And then be aware of the officers in that area. Our senior lead officers are the ones that are out there, our community liaison officers. And we always have them work with our vendors to try to educate them also, but more importantly, support them if there's any issues with violence or crime within those areas. Next slide, please. And then we'll go into the question session, unless there's, I think there's another presentation, but I'll turn it over to the group now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Commander, for that presentation. At this time, we would like to open the floor for any questions or answers you may have. If you go to the bottom of your screen panel, you will see a box that says Q&A. Please press that, and you will be able to ask your questions through this box, and we will be answering them live during this presentation. Great. So we do have a question that came in. Hi, I would like to know if sometime in the near future vending will not be allowed. In the area I live in, sidewalk vending is becoming an issue.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question, Elise?
Yes. Will sometime in the future sidewalk vending not be allowed? In the area that this person lives in, sidewalk vending is becoming an issue.
No, not at this point. I mean, they decriminalized it last year, or I'm sorry, in 2019 to try to regulate it. So at this point, there's not even any discussions that they're going to stop vending and making it legal, or keeping it legal rather.
We have one more question. Who do I call to verify a street vendor has a permit and the location it is approved for? That would be for Chief Rivera.
Well, they can, if they have complaints, they can submit it through 311, create a service request, and we'll do our follow-up. We can't necessarily provide that information. We would follow up on it. They can call our office, and then we can check that way as well.
We have another question. This is from an anonymous attendee. What are your recommendations to handle vendors being harassed? Vendors can be harassed by business owners and passerby.
Like I said earlier, we have a vending hotline, and those are the kind of complaints that we would like to address. They call that hotline, give us the information. If they can give us a description, or if they know who the person is, we'll send a team out there and talk to them and advise them that what they're doing is not necessarily a criminal act. Maybe they're in violation of how they set up or something, of the rules and regulations. And we'll go out there and we'll do our education and outreach and inform those people and what they're doing. And we can also talk, if they have the information of the person who is doing the harassment, we will also address those as well directly to that person if we have enough information to contact them.
Thank you. And we can put that hotline number in the chat. We have another question from Isabel Ramirez. Hi, how do you follow up on the investigation?
Cecilia, real quick, one more thing. Permits are not location specific at this time. So they can vend anywhere in the city as long as they follow the rules and regulations and comply with that.
Great.
I'm sorry, what was the next question?
How do you follow up on an investigation?
For us, a Streets LA investigation?
I'm going to say yes.
Okay. We will go out there, depending on what the complaint is, contact the vendor to find out if they are permitted, and that we would educate them as to how to follow the rules and regulations. If they're in a location that they shouldn't be, we can suggest, hey, maybe move down the block, and just go over the rules and regulations with them so we can instruct them how to set up legally.
Great. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. Are street vendors allowed on private property?
Well, if they're on private property, then it depends on what you're talking about private property. I know some move on to, say, on the corner, they'll move on to a gas station, and they think that our task force can't address those issues. But what happens once you move on to private property, then we'll forward the complaint to building and safety, because they're still in violation if they move on to private property. Once they do that, you have to have a change of use permit from building and safety, or the fire department as well, depending on what type of business or if that's where they moved on to. Then actually the property owners can be held responsible for those people on their that are vending on their property, and they would have to get a trespass order or something like that to get them off the property. So just because they're on private property doesn't mean that we won't enforce it.
Thank you. We have another question. Since vending was allowed in 2019 and no talks of stopping sidewalk vending, who can this issue be addressed to? Councilman's office?
To make it illegal again?
To stop sidewalk vending.
Well, it came from the state, SB, was it 946? So we'd have to go to their legislator to change that.
Thank you. Next question. I was given a warning by Streets LA for vending on a red zone, but I'm on the sidewalk. Is that not allowed?
No, it's not. I seen a screen that had, there you go. And also in the rules and regulations, it will tell you that you're not allowed to vend in a red zone. Because normally what it is a lot of the red zones are like at a corner, And so they don't want an issue with that, you know, being an obstruction for the crosswalks, that type of thing. So no, there is no vending allowed in a red zone.
Thank you. We don't have any other questions in the chat. We can give everyone another moment to submit any questions they have. Okay, looks like that's it. Chief Rivera, do you have any closing remarks?
Just that, you know, we'd like everybody to, you know, get their permit as soon as they can at this point. It's still at the lower cost of the $291. Before it goes up, I'm at this point, it's scheduled to go up to $541 in July. So if everyone can, you know, get their permits, that'd be great. And we just, you know, want some cooperation. We want to work together with the vendors. We would want, you know, everybody to thrive while they're out there doing that. I mean, we understand that, you know, they're doing it to help support their families and everything. So we don't want to hinder them, but we also would like some cooperation and to set up properly and to follow the rules and regulations. So that way everyone gets a chance to vend and hopefully not, you know, not create any more problems.
Thank you. And we did get a couple other questions through the chat. Next question, is street vending allowed on corner intersections?
Oh, that kind of addresses the other point. If it's depends on if it's a red zone or not. And then as long as they follow the rules and regulations. I mean, if is there a bus stop? Is there a tree well? Is there parking meters? So all that's covered in the rules and regulations and where they can set up. If there's not a rule or regulation covering where they're set up, then, you know, it could be a legal spot.
And this next question I'm going to throw to Angelica. Are there any grants available?
Hello, that is something that both at the local, state, and federal level have been discussed. So that's in the works right now in terms of providing resources for our vendors, which is why we're encouraging, if you, for instance, are somebody who is a food vendor, I know that there is a cost associated with your cart. We're highly encouraging people to move through the process to acquire the merchandise, a general vendor permit. That's going to then set you up as somebody who's legit, as a legit business. They're going to have to start somewhere in terms of identifying vendors, and we want you to have a permit. It could be the basic permit, and once you move through the process, then you would be eligible when there are dollars, and there will be dollars. We have heard Mayor Garcetti talk about different pockets of money, as well as the county is currently working on a pilot program. So I encourage you to stay connected on our website for details, and then also be aware of any upcoming webinars where we'll be sharing information. So yes, there will be resources, and our advice is to look at the process of getting permitted as a merchandise vendor, even though you're a food vendor, so that you're in our system.
Thank you, Angelica. Commander Labrada, do you have any closing remarks?
Yes, again, thank you so much for the opportunity. It was a great opportunity to just discuss some of the safety issues, but I really can't stress enough regarding the responsibility issue as well. We'll continue to work with you. I really stress that we get information on those crimes, and we work towards our vendors to be more open about crime. I know trust is an issue, and we're working towards that, and that's important. But more importantly, for them to report any incidents of them being victims. And then secondly, for them to get to know the vendors, one another, work with one another, the businesses and the residents, so they can be responsible. You know, this is an opportunity for everybody to work together. I know that's challenging considering everybody's trying to work, you know, in a direction of making a dollar, but it's important we do that. If we can look out for one another, help one another, and be more responsible to keep our communities safe, and then use some of those practices when it comes to safety for one another, I think we'll minimize our crime impact. And then we will respond to those crimes of, you know, incidents of crime, whether they're hate crimes or just, you know, other crimes towards our vendors. But it's important that we try to minimize that by awareness and try to prevent it. That's our best goal, is to prevent this crime. So thank you all, and always available if anybody needs anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Commander Labrada. And we got one more question. Can we get a copy of the PPT? It's very hard to see all the information you put up, and a copy would be helpful.
Yes,
Elise is,
that question actually. So this this webinar is recorded, and so we will be sending that out to all of the stakeholders, as well as putting this up on our sidewalk vending website. This should be accessible in the coming days, and so you'll be able to refer back to this entire presentation, both in English and in Spanish.
thank you, Elise. It looks like there's no more questions. Commissioner Villegas, do you have any final closing remarks?
Thank you for that. I hope that our audience was able to find this useful. I think that we shared just some, basic information as we're trying to move to open up all of Los Angeles, and having order and just providing, as much clarity as possible for street vending. We know that they're a part of the fabric of Los Angeles. We know that street vending is a viable economy for Los Angeles. And we just want to make sure that everyone is safe, and that we're just following, some of the guidelines here. And like you heard earlier, if you're still doing food vending, still register with us as merchandise, because it's just, you'll be able to get more information, as things progress and as things change. And this subject is also learning and changing as well. So we need to stay in communication with you, as you need to stay in communication with us. So please just check back on Streets LA website as well, as much as possible, with any of the other associations that you all work with, because there's changes constantly. I wouldn't be surprised that before the end of the year, we have a slightly different program. Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you everyone for joining. Please take a look at the chat. There's a correction to this last slide. And thank you to all our panelists for being here.